Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on managing an enterprise geodatabase with ArcGIS Pro. I'm John, and with me today is Rahul. For those of you who haven't attended one of our webinars, we're recording the session and we'll email you the recording along with the slides after the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions about this webinar, feel free to contact Rahul or myself. Now, if you have any questions about the content we're presenting, please use the Q&A panel. Be sure to choose Ask All Panelists and then type your question in the box and click Send. Rahul and I will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type your question in at any time. Excuse me. The goal of this webinar is to take a look at a broad range of topics tied to working in an enterprise geodatabase using Pro. Please feel free to let us know if we miss a topic that you're interested in so that we can consider it for a future webinar. Now, this webinar is designed to help you with data management tools in ArcGIS Pro, creating an enterprise geodatabase, creating data and modeling behavior, and finally, multi-user editing in ArcGIS Pro. Now, a lot of presentations around ArcGIS Pro so far have focused on many of the new features and workflows, but it's really important to note that the geodatabase, a file or enterprise, is still a core component of the ArcGIS system. Now, ArcGIS Pro supports connecting to many of the same databases currently supported by ArcMap. Now, let's take a quick look at some of the core ArcGIS Pro views and tools that are used for managing data. Now, ArcGIS Pro uses a ribbon-based contextual interface. Core tools are grouped on tabs that interact with either the active map or catalog view. Pro uses a project-based folder structure that is designed to manage multiple resources within your project. These tools are integrated into a single application that supports content from all different sources. Now, the catalog is a starting point for many of your data management workflows. So if you're familiar with our catalog, then you already know most of what there is to know about the catalog. It provides tools for discovering content, connecting to your databases, and for managing data. The catalog is available as either a dockable pane or a more comprehensive view. Now, the catalog pane is one of the first things you see when you create or open a new project, and in fact, it's a launch pad where a lot of what you're going to do starts from. It allows you to drill down into folders and databases using an Explorer-like UI. Now, it's similar to the dockable catalog available in ArcMap, but it also provides access to your project-based resources in Pro. Now, the catalog view is a little closer to our catalog. It provides similar functionality to the pane while providing more detail on the individual data sets and content. The view also provides tools for previewing the data set as well as reviewing and editing metadata. Now, they actually all contain context menus that give you an opportunity to have quick access to tools that configure database connections, create new objects, manage existing ones, and in fact, you'll see a lot of similar tools that you were used to in ArcGIS Pro, and actually a lot of similar workflows that we've done in ArcMap and our catalog before. You'll see a lot of similar workflows that we can continue to do in Pro using the catalog. Now, most data management and administrative work is done with geoprocessing tools, and many of these tools you'll be familiar with already if you've used them in our catalog or in ArcMap. The data management toolbox provides a large set of tools for creating, managing, and maintaining data sets in the enterprise geodatabase. For example, the toolbox provides tools for data creation, for example, the feature class, fields, or table tool sets, data loading, like the append or copy tools located in the general tool set, data modeling, and a little bit later, Rahul will go over some of the data modeling tools that we use from the ribbon and the interface, but a lot of those same tools are sitting in the geoprocessing, in the geoprocessing toolbox as well as data administration. And especially for those of you familiar with the SE command line, many of these tools have been ported to the geodatabase administration toolbox. For example, tools to manage SE log files, DB-tune parameters, or diagnosing a versioning issue, as well as a whole bunch of other tools tied to creating enterprise geodatabases and some of the objects and managing some of the objects within them. Now, what's nice, one of the main benefits of using the geoprocessing framework is that a manual workflow can easily be translated to a more automated one using either Model Builder or Python, especially having the ability to drag and drop some of your previously run tasks in order to create templates and, for some of the scripts you might run, or create templates for scripts that you might add more logic to later on. Now, here's a quick cheat sheet on the common tools a geodatabase administrator might use on a regular basis. Rule and I will be going through some of these tools in more detail over the course of the session, especially the database, enabling enterprise geodatabases, and some of the role and user-based ones. But what's important to note here is that many of the current ArcMap, ArcCatalog-based workflows that you currently have will continue to work using ArcGIS Pro and the geoprocessing framework. So let's take a quick look at Pro and some of these tools. We'll get into some more detailed demo later, but right now let's just take a look at how the catalog and geoprocessing work. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right. As you can see here, I actually already have ArcGIS Pro started. This is just a launch pad for creating a brand new project. I have a few projects that I've already worked in, but for this particular demo, I'm going to create a brand new project. So I'm just going to select blank, and I'm going to create a brand new blank project for this first demo here. I click OK. Excuse me. Now, when Pro starts up, as you can see, what we have in front of us right now is both the catalog pane and the catalog view. Of course, you can configure this differently as how you like. For me, I currently have the catalog pages open, ready to go for me to start doing some data work. Now, as you can see across the top here, there's a whole bunch of core-based tabs that provide function and features based on the currently active view. If I had decided to go to Insert and create a brand new map, this layout will change a little bit to support tools that are best used within a map-based view. Now, before we get into maps and catalog, what I really want to show you is just some of the key things I use to make my life a little easier while I'm working in Pro. First off, if we click on the Project tab here, this actually gives us an area where we can configure a whole bunch of settings that we might either want to persist between projects or persist within this particular project. So first thing I do is click on Portals. This isn't important to us right now, but it will be important later on when I talk about branch versioning. But of course, I need to make sure that my portal connections are configured and ready to go for the work I'm going to do. The check mark suggests that this is my active portal that I will be publishing information to. Now, we're not going to get too much into that until later. And this one with the key is that's actually the ArcGIS Online environment where I am getting my licensing from. Now, really what I'm interested in is the options here. And some of the options that are important to me as somebody working in the geodatabase, while there are a few tied to this specific project, I'm interested in some of the application-based settings. But before I jump into that, one thing that I can do is I can, of course, set up a default geodatabase for my current project if I don't like that one. Or I can actually go into the General tab here and for all applications set a specific default geodatabase I would like to use for my work. This could be a file-based geodatabase or this could be an enterprise. Typically, if it's Scratch-based work, I probably would use a file-based geodatabase. Now, the other thing, and this is important for me, a lot of the data I work in isn't always in Web Mercator. It's probably going to be in a projection that I'm more interested in or need to use the specific area I'm in. So what I do here is I make sure that I either have a base map that typically uses the default projection I like to use, or I just set it to none when I open a brand new map. The reason being is if I actually have this set to use a map that is typically in Web Mercator, then there'll be some projection on the fly which might slow down my initial map session, and I may not want that, especially when I'm really just editing and working in data. However, if I do want to use a base map, I can set this, but again, I may want to use a base map that is a bit better for the projections that contain a projection that I might be regularly using if I'm not working in Web Mercator, which you can do. I can create base maps that are in other projections other than just Web Mercator. Of course, you can use the Web Mercator ones, it just, there might be a lag when it's projecting some stuff on the fly. Another area is the editing tabs. We're going to talk a little bit about editing later. Some of the settings that matter to us, of course, are tied to how a version session works. We will talk about that a little later when we get into multi-user editing. Geoprocessing, again, this actually is important to me, and I'm going to put this out there, maybe to even save some of the tech support guys. When I'm working with geoprocessing and an enterprise geodatabase, it's important to know that if metadata about the tasks I've run is being logged to the enterprise geodatabase, that gets logged into a specific table within the SDA repository, and it actually can grow quite big and can create some locks. This is really best suited for file geodatabases. So I often turn this off so that I'm not putting that metadata in my geodatabase. Of course, it's up to you, and I know it's nice to know how often you run a compressed. It's just that can grow, and that can create some locks that slow down a lot of concurrent sessions, or at least the connecting of a lot of concurrent sessions. However, I might want to write this to a log file locally on my machine. Just some other key settings. You know, how do I like to look at metadata? For those of us who've been using metadata for years, I may actually not want the item description, which is the default that we have. I may want to use one of the ISO-specific settings for viewing and generating metadata. And the last setting I want to look at just very quickly is sometimes this indexing service will run in the back end, and that's fine. We may want to index all the content on our machine. But sometimes if your machine doesn't have a lot of resources, you may not want this process running in the back end very often. I actually often turn it off, but it's just something to note. But again, you may want to have it if you need to make sure that you want to search all the data that might be on your machine a little faster, and that's fine. So I'm going to click cancel, and I'm going to head back into the catalog area here. And what you'll notice here in the catalog view and in the catalog pane is it looks very similar in many ways to our catalog. One thing I'm going to do, let's actually start with something very simple. I need to create a new database connection. And I can do that very easily just by right mouse clicking on my database options for my project and specifying new database connection. And a lot of the settings are very similar to the same connection tool you might have seen in our catalog. So I'm going to create I'm actually using Postgres in my samples here. Of course, this could be any of the other databases we support, Oracle, SQL Server, Altabase, etc., DB2. I'm using Postgres, and I'm going to connect to right now it should just be an empty database that I'd like to add some data to. So I'm just going to give this a name. And away I go. So now I have this empty database, and if I go over here, I can actually see it. If I click on this database here, I can actually get some metadata information about it, but there really isn't much in my database right now, so I'm not going to worry about that. What I want to show you is, well, I'd like to, actually the first thing I'd like to do is I actually have some data I want to load into this. So I'm going to right mouse click on my folders. I'm going to select Add Folder Connection, and I want to actually just add a folder that contains some of my local data that I want to load into my geodatabase. So this is just some project data I have in my geodatabase folder. And it's just some data for Halifax Parks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just right mouse click on this and go New Feature Class. And I can actually create feature classes using geoprocessing tools or a more wizard-based workflow, kind of like what you see here. Again, it's carrying over some of the similar looking feel you had in our catalog. I'm going to call this layer Parks, and I'm going to click Next. Now, again, I can import my fields from my source data, this Parks layer from the file geodatabase that I have this raw data in. And again, here my fields load in. I can add more if I want. I'm going to click Next. And again, here's where I set my spatial reference. Now, again, this data is not in Web Mercator, so I'm just going to import the spatial reference from my file geodatabase data as well. Now, don't worry, I'm going to show you a way to get the data in a little easier in a few moments. But for now, I just want to work through this particular workflow. I'm going to select the defaults for the tolerance. I'm going to select the defaults for the resolution. I can, of course, go in and use configuration keywords like I used to if you really like to control your storage, and click Finish. So this is going to create a brand new feature class for me that I can now use and load data into. So we'll just wait for that very quickly to run. Should be done any second now, if I'm lucky. And there we go. All right. So I have this brand new feature class. If I click here, I can now see, and if I don't like that metadata, I can actually go in and I can actually change the metadata style. If I'm in the catalog pane here, I can actually preview the data, which I don't have any yet in there, so it's just going to be blank. I can click on the metadata tab, and if I want, I can actually edit the metadata and add more information if you want to actually, change the metadata that's there, that's created by default. I'm not going to do that right now. Now, the next thing I want to do very quickly is I just want to load some data into this parks layer. So I'm going to, what I really want to show you is some geoprocessing tools. So I'm going to click on Analysis here, and I see this tool option. What this does is launch my geoprocessing window. If I know the tool that I want to get at, I can go straight to the toolbox and open it up. If I know the name of the tool, I can type it in at the top here and click on it. And now I'm going to run this particular append tool so that I can load some data into my geodatabase. So, like it is with ArcGIS Catalog, I can drag and drop the data set I want to load into the toolbar. I can specify the target data set that I want to actually load it to and click Run. And the tool runs, the data is complete, and here's some results. Now, very quickly, I want to show you now that I actually have run and used geoprocessing, so the last thing I want to show you here is that I can now take that same information and create Python scripts from it. And this is a great way for automating a lot of what you do. Now, just see, I can type any command in there and it'll run it. What's also kind of cool is I can just go to my geoprocessing history, and I can just drag and drop this task right in there, and there we go. The actual command will run again, and if I run this again, it's going to actually reappend all of that data in there. The last thing I want to show you very quickly is another way that I can add this data that you might be used to. Sorry, I lost my catalog view there. Open my catalog pane again. Go to Project. I can copy the data and just paste it right in, just the way we used to. And of course, in this case, it has a different name. So I'm going to stop right there, and I think we're going to hand it over to Rahul, and he's going to have an opportunity to show you and discuss a little bit about creating enterprise geodatabases. So go ahead.
Thanks, John. So before we go ahead and look at some new functionality that's available in Pro, let's start by reviewing some of what you could do with ArcMap and how you do it in Pro, starting with geodatabase creation. So before you create an enterprise geodatabase, you need to decide whether or not one is required for your workflows. Similar to ArcCatalog, ArcGIS Pro has the ability to connect to and work with both spatial and non-spatial data on several supported platforms. While more functionality is available with an enterprise geodatabase, you can still do a lot with Pro even if one isn't present. You can use ArcGIS Pro to visualize spatial and non-spatial data from a database in a map or a scene. ArcGIS Pro consumes these data through query layers similar to ArcMap. Users of ArcGIS Pro can go one step further and define parameters as part of the query layer. These parameters make the query layer more dynamic and therefore more responsive to the potential needs of an end user. Whereas authoring a map in ArcMap may have required 3 different query layers to aggregate rainfall by day, week, or month, the use of a parameterized query layer in ArcGIS Pro allows you to do the same thing with a single layer. ArcGIS Pro can run many geoprocessing tools, as John was saying, and they can be used to analyze your data. Any tool listed in the documentation as accepting a feature layer as input should work with a query layer, assuming correct selection of supported unique identifier and geometry types. One thing to keep in mind is that if the tool being run is one that adds records to an existing table, the table must contain a database-maintained unique identifier, which you can add using the Add Incrementing ID field tool. ArcGIS Pro also allows you to author SQL in your query layer that filters data, returning only a subset of the rows present in a given table. This gives you finer-grained control of what end users consuming a project might see when working with these query layers. Filtering at the query layer level doesn't persist outside of ArcGIS Pro. However, you can use the same SQL query to author a database view, which will persist. You can do this with the Create Database View tool. ArcGIS Pro provides several tools and views that you can use to manage data in a database as well. You can use Change Privileges as the table owner to grant or revoke privileges to and from users and roles, while Rebuild Indexes and Analyze Datasets can be used to manage indexes and statistics. If the underlying DBMS system allows it, the catalog pane even allows you to rename an existing table. Last but not least, you can use ArcGIS Pro to load data from other data sources into your database. You can do this, you can right-click and copy-paste data, as John was mentioning, and for tables that contain database unique identifier fields, geoprocessing options are available as well, such as feature class to feature class, copy, and append. So now that we've covered what ArcGIS Pro can do with a database, let's quickly recap some of the additional functionality you get with an enterprise geodatabase. This is not an exhaustive list, but it would be the most common set of value adds that you would get when enabling geodatabase functionality. It's worth noting that this is additional functionality with the geodatabase, which means that everything we just discussed will continue to remain available. An enterprise geodatabase allows the creation of feature datasets, which are constructs that can contain multiple feature classes. Although people can use feature datasets for data organization, their primary purpose is to house data that will be used in one or more of the complex objects that the enterprise geodatabase allows. These objects in Pro are similar to the ones you're used to from ArcMap. You would use a topology to maintain geometry integrity, and you would use a network dataset to model transportation flow. The main difference with ArcGIS Pro is that geometric network data is read-only. Earlier this year, Esri introduced the utility network, a next-generation data model for working with different types of networks such as electric, gas, and water. The utility network leverages a services-oriented architecture and a new editing workflow to integrate more seamlessly with the rest of the ArcGIS platform, and it's going to be the native utility solution for ArcGIS Pro going forward. An enterprise geodatabase allows you to control data integrity through the use of domains and subtypes. ArcGIS Pro has views for fields, domains, and subtypes, and between these views you can create subtypes, author domains, and manage domain assignment. ArcGIS Pro also introduces a new option that you can use called an attribute rule, which allows for active enforcement of integrity constraints right at the time an edit is made. We'll be touching on attribute rules a bit further later in this webinar. ArcGIS Pro also enhances existing geodatabase data transfer workflows with the Preserve Global IDs environment setting, which allows tools like Append to maintain the same global ID values in the target dataset that were present in the source dataset, provided the global ID field has a unique index. Enterprise geodatabases also introduce functionality that allow the same data to be edited by multiple users simultaneously. Some of these are going to be familiar to you from ArcMap, such as traditional versioning with the Move to Base option. ArcGIS Pro also introduces branch versioning, which John will be discussing later on. So now that we've reviewed the differences between databases and geodatabases and what you can expect from both in Pro, let's touch on how to create an enterprise geodatabase using Pro. The two tools that we're going to be talking about here have been available through desktop since version 10.1, so Pro is not adding a whole lot in this area that you wouldn't already be familiar with if you've done that before. If you want ArcGIS to handle the entire process from start to finish, use the Create Enterprise Geodatabase tool. This tool works for environments in SQL Server, Oracle, and Postgres, and creates the SDE user and the geodatabase repository. As this tool creates a user, grants it privileges, creates the geodatabase, and in some cases the database as well, it requires DBA access to run. Although geodatabase functionality is mostly vendor neutral between different database platforms, setup may differ slightly. For example, use of the ST-Geometry SQL API in Oracle requires the configuration of an additional library through Oracle's XProc, but you can create the base geodatabase without it. Refer to the documentation for any database-specific requirements. If the database administrator and geodatabase administrator are two different people in the organization, and the DBA doesn't want to provide those credentials, an alternate workflow would be for the DBA to configure the database and the SDE user, at which point the geodatabase administrator can then run Enable Enterprise Geodatabase to create the geodatabase repository. So now that we've reviewed some of that material, let's take a quick look at creating an enterprise geodatabase before we move on to the next section. So I'm just going to go ahead and share out my ArcGIS Pro. And you can see here in the geoprocessing pane that I've already searched for the Create Enterprise Geodatabase tool. So I'm just going to open the tool up here, and you can see that it loads with the parameters that you already be familiar with from our catalog if you've created an enterprise geodatabase before. So similar to John, I'm on the Postgres bandwagon for the purposes of this webinar. So I'm going to switch my database platform to Postgres, put in my instance name, and we're just going to call our database demo GDB here. I'm going to supply a password for my Postgres user and an ultra super secure password for my geodatabase administrator. And once I browse to my license file here, I'm now ready to run the tool. And similar to what you would see in our catalog, you'll see in Pro progress being reported as the geodatabase is being created. So you can see here the last step being the check for the STGeometry library in the Postgres lib folder. And once this tool completes, it's going to have a completed enterprise geodatabase in Postgres that I can now connect to with either the Postgres or the SDE user. So I can go ahead and I can create a new connection here as the Postgres user to my new database. And having done that, I've now verified that I've got that enterprise geodatabase created and ready to go. So regardless of whether you're working with a database or a geodatabase, ArcGIS Pro provides you with tools to manage users, roles, and privileges. Although databases differ slightly in the specifics, all vendors that are supported by Esri tools use the same basic approach to users, roles, and privileges. A user is an account in the database, authenticated through the database or the operating system, depending on how your security model is configured. ArcGIS Pro has the ability to create users and optionally assign the created user a role using the Create Database User geoprocessing tool. If an end user wants to do something in the database, they need to have the appropriate privileges to do so. Most privileges can be broken down into two major types. Privileges granted at the database level are called system-level privileges and generally refer to tasks that a user would perform in the database, such as connecting or creating a table. Although ArcGIS Pro doesn't natively have a tool for granting specific system-level privileges, they are granted through some of the other tools. Create Enterprise Geodatabase will grant the SDE user the necessary minimum privileges to be a geodatabase administrator, and Create Database User will grant the created user sufficient privileges to be a data owner. Privileges granted on specific feature classes, tables, or feature data sets are referred to as object-level privileges. For configuring object-level privileges, ArcGIS Pro offers both the Change Privileges tool as well as the Privileges dialog box, which can be brought up through a data owner connection by right-clicking on the object in question. A more efficient way of managing both system and object-level privileges is to grant them to roles and then grant those roles to any users that might need the privileges. ArcGIS Pro provides the Create Role tool, both for creating new roles and for granting and revoking both new and existing roles from sets of users. So let's take a quick look at creating users, roles, and granting privileges before we move on to the next section. So I'm going to take you back into ArcGIS Pro here, and just leaving off right from where we stopped at the last demo, having just created our geodatabase. So I'm going to go back into the geoprocessing pane, and we're going to create a couple of users here. So for my first user, this is going to be the user that will eventually be my data owner, and I'm going to call that user GIS admin. And so that user's now been created, and if I flip back over to the catalog pane here, I should now be able to establish a new connection as that GIS admin user. And I'm just going to name that GIS admin to help me keep track of the two of them here. And just to verify that this user does have the necessary system-level privileges to be a data owner, I'm going to copy in some sample data into my GIS admin connection here. And so Postgres does enforce the concept of user schema matching for an enterprise geodatabase, and the matching GIS admin schema would have been created by that same Create Database User tool. So we can see here that the feature class got copied in successfully, and if I right-click and bring up the properties of the feature class, you can see here that because this user is the data owner, it has all four of the primary object-level privileges: select, insert, update, and delete. So what we're going to do next here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a second database user, and we're going to call that user GIS Viewer. Now, one thing to keep in mind here if you're using create database user to create this user is that this user technically does have more privileges than they need to be a viewer because they have enough privileges to be a data owner. So if you're creating viewer users that really only need to connect to the database, you might want to use something like pgadmin or the database's native software to do that, or just keep in mind that you might want to go and revoke some privileges after the fact. So at the same time that I create a database user here, I'm also going to go ahead and create a role. And while we're creating this role, we're going to go ahead and actually assign the role to the user. So I'm going to call this my viewer role, and I'm going to assign that role to the GIS viewer user that I just created. And if we run this, that tool completes successfully, and I'm just going to flip back over into my catalog pane and make another connection here as my GIS viewer user. And having made that connection and renaming it so I don't forget that in a moment here, if I go ahead and expand this connection, you can see at the moment that the GIS viewer does not have visibility on this feature class, which makes sense because we haven't granted any privileges yet. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on this feature class through my data owner connection, manage the privileges, add the viewer role here, and give the viewer role select. If we hit apply and OK on that, and then refresh our GIS viewer connection, you can now see that the GIS viewer user is able to see that feature class. And if I go into the properties, it has specifically just select privileges. Similarly, if I run the create role tool one more time, this time against an existing role, but specify that I want to revoke that role from the GIS viewer user, I can then go and refresh my connection here, and the GIS viewer user is no longer able to see that feature class. So we just created 2 new users, 1 new role, imported some data, and configured some privileges. And if you've done these tasks before using the tools in our catalog, there probably wasn't too much new there for you, so it should quickly become second nature. So now that we've covered creating an enterprise geodatabase and configuring some basic security, we can take a look at the data modeling that you can accomplish with Pro. We'll start with some of the things you were already able to do in desktop and how you do them in Pro, and then we'll move on to some new functionality. 3 aspects of a feature class or table that we were able to manipulate using desktop were its fields, attribute domains, and subtypes. ArcGIS Pro provides access to all 3 through the Design section of the Data tab. Clicking on any of the 3 views will add a new tab to your ribbon and a new pane to your map. You can also access these views through right-clicking on your feature class in the Catalog pane, although slightly different options will be available. Clicking on the Fields button in the Design tab will expose the Fields tab, which allows you several options for working with your layer. You can use this tab to access the domains view and the subtypes view of the selected layer, or you can use it to add a new field. The filter option is meant to be used with the Fields pane, which is opened at the same time. You can use the filter tools to pull out a specific field name from the tabular view you're presented with in the Fields pane, which is useful if you're looking for a specific field to alter. Similarly, you can use the filter domain option to filter out any fields not associated with a specific domain. In addition to using the new field button on the Fields tab, you can also click at the bottom of the Fields pane in order to add a new field. The Fields pane gives you many options for viewing and editing the properties of your fields, such as the alias and domain. If you open the view through the layer properties rather than the catalog pane, you'll get additional options, like including the field's visibility in your map and whether or not it's editable. ArcGIS Pro also provides tools in the Fields toolset that you can use to work with fields. Examples include adding fields, altering existing fields, assigning default values, and deleting a field. Working with database or geodatabase managed fields, such as editor tracking and incrementing ID fields, can also be managed from the same toolset. The subtypes view allows you to view existing subtypes, edit their properties and values, create new subtypes, and delete existing subtypes. Geoprocessing tools are also available for these processes. Subtypes are structurally the same between ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro, but ArcGIS Pro can consume them more efficiently through a subtype group layer, which makes a single call to the source data for the whole group, but allows you to set the properties of each subtype layer individually. Lastly, the domains view allows you to view, edit, and delete existing domains and create new ones. You can think of this as being analogous to the domains tab of the geodatabase properties in our catalog. This means that domain properties can be designed in here, but you'll want to use the fields or subtypes views or a geoprocessing tool to manage assignments. Now that we're caught up on how to work with items in Pro that we're used to working with in Desktop, let's take a look at a new piece of functionality that you get when you move over to ArcGIS Pro, and that is the attribute rule. An attribute rule is defined by a specific user on a specific data set and can be created at the object class or subtype level. Attribute rules are a property of the data set they are created on, which means that at the moment, multiple data sets cannot share the same attribute rule. Similarly, if you delete a data set, the attribute rules are deleted with it too. Attribute rules are currently only supported on data sets hosted in an enterprise geodatabase. The purpose of an attribute rule is to help enhance the editing experience, allowing the enforcement of data integrity at the time an edit is made. They can be used to enforce specific combinations of attribute values or to automatically update a target field. One thing to keep in mind about attribute rules is that they are a pro-specific functionality. So unlike domains and subtypes, which function the same in both, attribute rules are brand new and specific to ArcGIS Pro. This means that if you decide to use them, the minimum client version to access the dataset is ArcGIS Pro 2.1, and it also means that you'll no longer be able to use the dataset in ArcMap. Therefore, a certain amount of planning is required before you start deploying them to your datasets, as you'll want to make sure those data are okay to use exclusively in ArcGIS Pro. Attribute rules are defined using the Arcade scripting language. Arcade is the cross-platform scripting language for the modern ArcGIS platform. It's portable, meaning scripts from ArcGIS Pro can work in a web map, and scripts from a web map can work on a mobile device. In order to understand attribute rules, you need to understand the two basic components that make up an attribute rule. These are the triggering events and the rule type. Triggering events can be inserts, updates, deletes, or all of the above, and attribute rules can be one of two types. Calculation rules are used to automatically populate attribute configurations on a feature when another attribute is set. Examples include concatenating multiple field values into a separate field or updating a second attribute based on the first attribute's value. Constraint rules specify which combinations of attributes can be allowed, and unlike calculation rules, they do not actually populate the attribute values. Therefore, constraint rules must always evaluate to true or false. When creating a constraint rule, you're required to supply an error number and message, which will be displayed to the user when their attempted edit violates a constraint rule. What makes this rule type even more powerful is that the edit will fail if the constraint is violated, so you can use it to prevent bad data from making it into your system of record. The Attribute Rules toolset provides 6 tools that are currently available for attribute rules. You can use the ArcPy describe function as well, running it on a data set and using it to print out the properties of the rules that have currently been defined. The add and delete attribute rule geoprocessing tools are fairly self-explanatory and allow you to create and delete attribute rules respectively. Enable and disable attribute rules allow you to keep the rule attached to a specific data set, but temporarily disable and enable it as needed. When a rule is disabled, it will not fire, even if one of its triggering events occurs. Disabling rules is useful for operations like batch data loads and deletes, and allows you to temporarily prevent the rule from being enforced without having to recreate it from scratch when you need it again. Although attribute rules currently share a one-to-one relationship with the data set on which they are defined, it is still possible to transfer those rules and redefine them on another data set. You can do this by first running export attribute rules, which outputs to a CSV file, and then you can import that CSV file into a different data set. This is also a useful workflow for editing multiple rules at once, as you can export the rules, delete them in the source data set, make your edits in the CSV file, and then re-import the edited file. So now that we've discussed the world of attribute rules, let's take some time to look at them in action. So I'm going to come back to my ArcGIS Pro here one more time, and we're actually going to open a map in my ArcGIS Pro view here, which I'm very excited about because I did not do it in either of my previous 2 demos. And I think you can see the symbology there okay. Yeah, looks good. And so this is basically just some sample data of hit locations in the Louisiana area. And the different decisions that you make about attribute rules are largely going to be dependent on what the business needs are in your organization. But if we take a quick look at the attribute table here, we can see that one thing that's true of a lot of fields here is that the values in them seem to be all uppercase. And we can use either a constraint rule or a calculation rule in order to help us enforce that happening. So I'm going to bring my geoprocessing pane back up here. And this time, I'm going to search for the Add Attribute Rule tool. And if we open that up, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a rule enforcing uppercase values in this operator field. So we'll just call it operator uppercase. And for my description here, I'll just say enforcement of uppercase spell it properly, uppercase values in the operator field. And for my type, I'm going to make this a constraint rule and input my Louisiana PITS data here. And for my triggering events, I'm going to set it to trigger anytime that field is updated. And I'm just going to load an arcade expression that I created ahead of time here. And all this expression is saying is that it's comparing the value into the operator field to the uppercase of that same value. And if they are equal, it returns true, otherwise returns false. The return of false is where the constraint rule error is actually going to fire. So I'm going to put in an error number here and an error message, uppercase values, please. And we're going to run that tool, which should go ahead and add the attribute rule to my data set. Having done that now, I'm going to go and I'm just going to add a new point here into my Pro. And we'll filter on that new point here. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to put in a lowercase value into the operator field. And you can see when I try to do that, I get a failure because I violated the attribute constraint rule that I just set. And it gives me back the number and the error message that I specified. I'm going to do this in an uppercase manner, and this time it ends up working out for me no problem. So that would be an example of how you could do it with a constraint rule, but you can actually do something similar with a calculation rule as well. So if I come back to my geoprocessing pane here, what I'm going to do is I'm this time going to create a rule on the PIT type field, and we'll call that PIT type uppercase values for PIT type. And we're going to flip the type here from constraint to calculation. And we're going to say that our target field here is the PIT type field. So if I just quickly flip back to the full view here, you can see that the values in the PIT type field are also all uppercase. The isEditable flag here basically controls whether or not the target field for the attribute rule is going to be editable by your end users. And in this case, I want it to be. So I'm going to set the triggering event to be an update. I'm going to clear my expression and load a new one here. And you can see this one is super simple. All it's doing is taking the value and converting it to uppercase. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run that. And once that attribute rule completes successfully, you can see here that if I try to put the word other in lowercase into the PIT type field, the attribute rule fires for me and automatically converts the value to uppercase. So in addition to looking at things like uppercase values in a field, another pretty cool use case for attribute rules would be to prevent certain types of features from getting deleted. And that's the last one we're going to look at here. So if we go ahead and we take a look at our status field here, we can see that we've got some PITs that are active and some PITs that are not. And I want to prevent my active PITs from getting deleted. So active PIT deletion prevention is going to be the name of this rule. And then prevent deletion of active PITs. I'm going to flip this back to a constraint rule. And this time, my triggering event is going to be a delete. We're going to erase that and load in my next arcade expression here. And you can see here it's returning false if it detects a deletion on a status of active. Otherwise, it's going to return true. I'm going to put in another error message here. Cannot delete active PITs. And we're going to run that. And once this attribute rule has been added successfully here, what we should find is that if I try to delete an abandoned PIT, it lets me do it. But if I try to delete an active one, I run into the other problem with the attribute rule, with the one that I just added, saying that I cannot delete active PITs. So our three rules were very simple in terms of how we leverage the arcade language, but hopefully it was enough for you to start to get an idea of just how powerful these rules can be and how they can help you streamline the edit session and prevent bad data from making it into your data sets. So with that in mind, I'm just going to hand it back over to John here, who will talk about the next section.
Thanks, Rahul. Let me just get my notes up here. Okay. All right, a key feature of an enterprise geodatabase is how it handles editing geospatial data concurrently. Now, ArcGIS Pro provides many of the same features you had in ArcMap and ArcCatalog, as well as adding a few newer ones. Now, database transactions are the glue that makes multi-user editing work. Transactions provide a way to organize how data is changed, committed, rolled back, or recovered. Now, by definition, a transaction is an all-or-nothing unit of work that maintains the consistency of the database while you're editing. Once saved, these changes persist within the database. Now, we refer to a short transaction as one that lives within the current session. Edits in a short transaction are always managed by the database's underlying transaction model, where the last committed edit wins. In the geodatabase world, we refer to this as non-versioned editing. The geodatabase also supports transactions that span across multiple sessions. This type of transaction is facilitated by the versioned editing model. ArcGIS Pro supports both the traditional versioning model of ArcGIS Desktop as well as a new optimized versioning model called branch versioning. We'll take a closer look at both this section. Now, transactions are created and applied within an edit session. An edit session can be used to group edits and provide a mechanism to save or undo changes. Edit sessions work differently in ArcGIS Pro than in ArcMap. So to better understand the differences, let's start by reviewing what we're used to, or for those of you who've used ArcMap, how an edit session currently works in ArcMap. In ArcMap, edit sessions are explicitly managed by the user performing the edits. In a non-versioned edit session, edits are saved automatically by default. However, you can also configure a non-versioned edit session to manually save edits. The life cycle of an edit session begins when the editor chooses to start the session. Likewise, it ends when the session is manually stopped. An edit session can consist of one or more edit operations or transactions. Depending on whether or not automatic save is enabled, each transaction will be made up of one or more edits, and that transaction ends when these edits are either saved or discarded. When using non-versioned editing, row locking is a concern. When the automatic save option is disabled, the transaction will include all edits between each manual save. All rows modified before saving your edits will be locked. This can prevent other sessions from editing new rows. In a multi-user editing environment, this can create situations where locks will block sessions and possibly create deadlocks. Now, ArcGIS Pro manages an edit session just a bit differently. When working in Pro, edit sessions start and stop automatically. So the edit session actually starts when you make an edit, and either save or discard that edit. What this means is that the DBMS transaction consists of a single edit. Now, that edit can update multiple rows, for example, when you're using the field calculator. However, the transaction is complete when the edit is finished or discarded. While this will not change how you work with version data sets, it can affect how non-version editing works. So just some benefits to automatic edit sessions is that they simplify your workflow. By saving with each edit, the transaction time is reduced, minimizing the time set of rows are locked. Of course, performing a large update on an entire table or complex DBMS logic can also impact the time a row is locked. And now this is a major drawback when editing in non-version data. This is not true for version data, but in non-version data, there is no undo redo option, which is why editing non-version data may not be an option for you in Pro or something you want to pursue, because this can cause many issues with interactive editing workflows, especially if data is accidentally deleted. It's better to use one of our versioned editing models for interactive multi-user editing workflows, especially if you need undo or redo capabilities. From my point of view, non-version editing really works best in environments that perform automated updates using geoprocessing tools, Python or SQL. In fact, you can use SQL to implement more fine-grained transactions for advanced non-version editing scenarios. So you can actually create transactions within your SQL statement, modifying multiple tables, and then committing or undoing and rollbacking depending on how you want to proceed. And you can do that kind of logic in SQL. So non-versioned editing is not really recommended in environments that have many concurrent editors and that these editors need an undo, redo kind of workflow. In these environments, you should be using a versioned workflow. Now, versioned workflows in ArcGIS Pro are very similar to what you may be using in ArcMap, if you're using ArcMap. Now, a version is an isolated workspace that allows users to concurrently edit data without worrying about row locking or changing production data sets. A geodatabase can contain multiple versions. Version workflows are recommended for multi-user editing or workflows that require transactions that continue beyond the current session. Unlike non-versioned editing in Pro, versioning supports undo-redo for each edit operation. We'll look at both types of versioning over the next few slides. Now, traditional versioning has been part of the geodatabase for a number of years. This workflow is intended for organizations that have who access the enterprise geodatabase directly. It is also meant for environments that edit advanced data sets like the network data set or a topology. In traditional versioning, editing is managed by storing a feature class or tables edits in a separate set of database tables. Edits are part of a larger lineage of changes that must be applied to create a specific view of the database. A version is a name given to the list of edits. At the root of the versioning hierarchy is the default version. While all user versions are an ancestor of default, multi-level hierarchies can be created to support more advanced workflows. So a transaction is known as a database state. It can consist of one or more edits that is part of a larger lineage of edits. Once you're done editing, you can merge changes from a parent or ancestor version into the current version. This is known as reconciling. This will identify any changes that are in conflict with another user's edits. The conflict manager allows you to review any conflicts that were identified during the reconcile process. You can configure your conflict to be flagged when there is a change to the row or just when both editors updated the same column. All conflicts must be resolved before your current session ends. Once each conflict has been managed, your edits need to be merged into the ancestor or target version. You complete the merging process by posting your changes to the target version. As the geodatabase is edited over time, the tables responsible for managing the deltas increase in size. You need to use the compressed geodatabase tool, geoprocessing tool, to remove edits that are no longer referenced by a version. The compressed tool also moves all edits that are common to all versions back to the business table. This helps optimize the performance of the database. An additional option exists to have all edits be moved to the business table when they are posted to the default version. Now, branch versioning supports a Web GIS editing model by providing multi-user editing scenarios for feature services. In this workflow, data is published as a federated feature service. This means our enterprise geodatabase is registered with ArcGIS Enterprise. Now, branch versioning is only available in ArcGIS Pro. A version is a point in time when new edits have branched off from the default version. When a branched version dataset is shared as a service, the option to enable the version management capability. This creates a version management service that is responsible for creating and managing versions. Unlike traditional versioning, a version is always a direct child of default. Branch versioning sees a transaction as an edit or collection of edits that occur at a point in time and is tied to a specific version or branch. When you reconcile a version, its branching off moment is updated to include the most recent edits in the default version. For this reason, default will always be the target version. With branch versioning, conflicts are identified at the row level. While the current version's changes will take precedent, the conflict manager can be used to review each conflict and make changes. Since conflicts are persisted in the geodatabase, you can manage conflicts over multiple sessions. Finally, the post operation merges any changes from the current version with default. Unlike traditional versioning, the compress operation is not required for branch versioning. Now, the next few slides really just talk about preparing for branch versioning, but I want to get to the demo to actually show you that how to particularly do this. So what I'm going to go through in the next demo is showing you how to configure your connection to start working with a branched version, how you configure some data in order to support branch versioning, some steps you need to do with ArcGIS Enterprise in order to make it available to branch versioning, your data available to ArcGIS Enterprise for branch versioning. And finally, we're going to talk about sharing a feature class as a web feature layer. I know we're kind of tight for time, so I'm just going to jump right into that demo. Okay, so hopefully everybody, you can stay with me for a few minutes. This shouldn't take too long. But what I want to do is I actually want to show you how branch versioning works and how I would set up my data for branch versioning. So what I have open here is my ArcGIS Pro environment, and I already have some database connections. First, before we just jump into branch versioning, the database connection here that is configured to support the traditional versioning model that we've been using for years. What I can do is, it's very simple for me to register this. Again, this is the traditional versioning, to register this as a traditional versioned data set, simply by right mouse clicking on the data, selecting manage, and registered as version. And for those of you who are familiar with, just again, traditional versioning from our catalog ArcMap, pretty much these delta tables are created, and I can use this and edit it in a map session in the same way I would have done this using ArcMap. Now, I'll show you in a bit how to actually switch to versions, connect to versions when we set up our branch version environment. But just the one last thing I want to show you with traditional versioning is if I right mouse click on my geodatabase connection and select versions, I can now get into an environment where I can create new versions or delete versions. So this is actually the version manager, and so I can easily just click on, if I want, the default version, select new, and I can now create a new child of the default version. Alternatively, if I want, I can click on a child version. I'm going to just save that. I can click on a child version, select new, and now what I've done is created a child of that particular version. What we're going to see in branch versioning is the parent is always going to be default. So I'll show you editing in a bit, but right now let's actually get to setting up branched versioning, which is really our new model that is in ArcGIS Pro only. So to set up branch versioning, the first thing I need to do, and this is actually important because if you get through all of these steps and this wasn't done, then you will actually be using data that is using the traditional versioning model. So the biggest thing to note is that I have to make sure that the versioning type is set to branch on my connection file. If I don't do that, then the next few steps that we do are not going to work. Or if things don't look the way you expect them to, go back to that first connection file and make sure that you've specified that it is a branch version type. So I'm going to click cancel because I know that that's done. So the next thing I need to do is I need to bring my data set, I need to open up my data set, and I need to prepare it for branch versioning. And in order to do that, branch versioning requires that the data set has global IDs, that the data set has editor tracking, and that the data set is registered as versioned. So what I'm going to do is very quickly go through each one of those steps. So I'm adding global IDs. I'm now going to go manage, and I'm going to enable editor tracking. So what editor tracking does is it's going to create some new fields in the data that allow me to manage who's connected and the time they make edits to the database. So who was connected when that edit was made, or who made that edit, and the time they made those edits. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to register this as versioned. Now, when I do that, I don't want to spend too much time looking at the data, but in the database side, what that does is it actually creates a bunch of new fields. Fields that manage the branch that this particular row is tied to. In that case, it's the actual version. So the branch, when I say branch and version, I mean them interchangeably. So this keeps track of what version I'm tied to and how current this particular row is. And those two fields together help make the branch versioning environment work. So I'm going to go back to my data set now, and everything is complete. And I'm actually going to add this to a new map. And as excited as Rahul was, now I am too, because I get to do the same thing. You can tell we read from a script most of it, and then now we want to joke around a little bit. But anyways, my data is now loaded. And the next thing I'm going to do is I need to actually, so the database that this data is sitting in, right now my ArcGIS Enterprise environment doesn't know anything about it. So if you remember from my slides, the way branch versioning works is I need to actually share this data with ArcGIS Enterprise because what we're actually going to be doing is editing feature services, which means that this has to be published to Enterprise. If you're using traditional versioning, you can continue in a client-server model. If you're using branch versioning, then you're going to be using this Web GIS model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Share tab up here, and I'm going to select Data Stores. And these are the existing data stores right now within my environment. I'm just going to select Add Database. I'm going to add my reference to my version database to this particular section here. Okay. I know it's 2 o'clock. I shouldn't be too much longer. I apologize. I'm going to add my branch. I'm going to add my database connection that is pointing to that's configured for branched versioning type. I'm going to select OK. I'm just going to give it a name. So what this step is doing is I am actually making sure that my ArcGIS server environment and my ArcGIS Enterprise environment can connect to this specific database because I'm not going to be using a managed data store. I'm actually going to be using my underlying enterprise geodatabase to store all of the data that I'm going to be editing. So now that's done, and I know that my enterprise environment can connect to this data. So the next step I'm going to do is I have to share this data with ArcGIS Enterprise. So the easy way to do that is I'm going to right mouse click on the layer, select sharing, and I'm going to share it as a web layer. One thing I should note while we're waiting for this to load up is I'm actually connected right now to a remote server. This is I'm running this on in Azure on an Azure VM. What I'm going to do is right now I'm just publishing data to an enterprise environment that is currently running in Azure. When I get to actually editing this stuff, I'm going to come back to my desktop and show that. So right now this is just I'm actually configuring the Azure environment to store and maintain this particular data set. Of course, you may want to have that internally or on an intranet or possibly, externally facing if you're building, applications that are meant for the internet that requires editing as well. That's really up to you. So I'm going to share this. Now the key here is that I'm going to be referencing register data. I'm not going to be copying my data. So what's going to happen is this means it's going to point to the same geodatabase and reference that data. Now I also need to make sure that I have the feature service capability enabled for this because I'm actually going to be editing this data as feature services within Pro. I'm going to select the configuration tab, and here this is key. I need to check off the version management options so that I can actually use my Web GIS environment, my ArcGIS Enterprise environment to create and delete or post and reconcile versions. I'm going to just check my feature environment here. I make sure that it's editing. I'm going to analyze this. And what's going to happen is this service is going to, I can actually ignore that one, and I'm just going to publish this. So right now I'm actually publishing this data as a service to ArcGIS Enterprise. Now this is going to take about 3 or 4 minutes, so I actually decided to actually already set up this data in ArcGIS Enterprise so that I can show, sorry, I need to get the, there we go, so that I can show you how all this works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open up another project. It is going to be this versioning project here. So I've already set up a local project. So what I've done is I've actually moved from the server to my local environment right now so that I can actually work with this data in ArcGIS Pro. And this data is now no longer sitting in it's in a database, but I'm not going to access it through the database. I'm actually going to access it using web services. And as you can see here, in fact, here, look, my parks data is actually already published. I actually already had this data published as Halifax Parks to the environment because I didn't want you guys to wait and see it actually published. So this is actually ArcGIS Enterprise, and now I'm actually accessing a feature service that I'm going to edit in a map. And again, now I'm going to open a map. And what's interesting here, so this is a feature service that just opened very quickly there. I'm going to select the data source option in my contents of the map. And what you're going to notice here is, by default here, I have a context-sensitive, I have a contextual menu up here for feature layer information. I'm going to click on my data source. And what you're going to see here now is I have a versioning context menu. And by clicking on that, I can get at my version manager, my reconcile post, changing versions, all that stuff. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to use version manager. I'm going to just delete this other version that I should have deleted before I started this demo. I'm going to right mouse click on default and go new, and I'm going to create a new version called edit 1. I'm also going to create another new one because I want to show you conflict management as well, called edit 2. And if I click save, these versions are created. What's important to note actually is when I create a new version, I don't have the option to have it be a child of any other version. In branch versioning, everything is a child of default, and that is an important difference from traditional versioning workflows that you might have been used to. So that's done. I'm going to now to change my version right now. This particular editing session is pointing to default. I'm going to right mouse click, go change version, and I'm going to jump into edit 1, and I'm going to start editing it. So we'll just, there we go. I'm going to just zoom in on some data here. Now again, I'm actually editing feature services published to an ArcGIS Enterprise environment. So now what I'm going to do is I can just open up an edit session and I can actually start editing this data. So I'm going to click on the edit tab. I can go in here. I can create a new park. I can move an existing park. So I can edit, update, and I can, if I want, delete a row. And what's nice now I can go back through all of those edits again in my undo redo. So up here, this is all the undo work. So if I want, I can undo that delete. And if I want, I can go back and redo that delete. So when I'm in the version environment, I have all the undo redo tools that I need. So I'm going to save my edits. And I am going to go back to my versioning tool because now I want to reconcile and post. So what I want to do is reconcile the data. What I'm doing is bringing down the changes that are currently in default into my environment. Now, there are no changes in default now. So this is actually going to be a quick operation regardless, even if there were changes, because all we're actually doing is just moving a timestamp. We're updating a field saying, the state of this particular database now started at time X, not time Y. So that is actually going to be a lot quicker than some of the traditional versioning workflows you used to use. And now I'm happy, so I'm going to click Post. So that's great. If I switch to my default version, I can see that my changes are now in default. If I go to my Edit 2 version, I still have the data the way it was before. And now, of course, I got to remember exactly which row I moved. Sorry, let me just go back quickly. I moved that one. Okay, sorry about that. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick edit in the second version where I am going to move a row. So I'm basically updating a row that I had updated in Edit 1. I'm going to submit that. I'm going to save that edit. I'm going to save all edits. And now I'm going to go back to my versioning tab and reconcile. So if I chose the right row, I get a window asking me to manage conflicts in the same way I would have in traditional versioning. I can come in here if I want. Now, by default, it is going to favor the Edit 2 sessions edit. I can go back and change it back to Edit 1 session, but I think my second edit was more important, so I'm going to leave it. Now, what's interesting here that I couldn't do in previous traditional versioning was I used to have to actually deal with every conflict before I actually left my session for the day. Now I can come in here and I can mark things as reviewed, and that is managed in a separate table within the database, and I can come back tomorrow and keep working through conflicts. So that is actually quite a benefit, especially for environments where there are a lot of conflicts that you have to manage. So I'm going to just mark this as resolved. I'm going to leave it. I will still get a little message with post, but it's okay. I've resolved all my conflicts. I'm going to click yes, and now I'm done. That's pretty much all I had to show you. I'm going to get back to my the slides, and we're just going to sort of finish this up. Again, thank you for being patient. I apologize that we've gone over a little bit, but thank you. Anyways, this is just a quick review of what we've done. We've added it to the slides so that you can use this as a reference later. So, I mean, what we talked about today, and I'm hoping you found this interesting and useful, we talked about some of the data management tools you can use in ArcGIS Pro. I'm hoping that you can see some things there that, allow you to bring workflows over from maybe your traditional ArcGIS desktop environment. We talked about how you can create enterprise geodatabases, as well as some of the data modeling tools that were there. We didn't go through everything. There's obviously relationship classes that you can still add as well, and as well as feature data sets and all those other components that are there as well. And of course, we looked at multi-user editing in ArcGIS. Here's some upcoming events and some good training courses that we provide, our excellent trainers provide here, managing geospatial data in ArcGIS, deploying and maintaining a multi-user geodatabase, and implementing version workflows in a multi-user geodatabase. So thank you very much for your time and participating in today's webinar. We will email you a recording of the webinar shortly, as well as a PDF of the slides. We'll also post any webinar recording to the archive page when it's ready. We would like to get your thoughts on the presentation, so please fill out a survey that comes up when you exit the webinar. We're now going to stop the recording, but we'll take some questions if you still want to ask a few, if you still got some time. Again, thank you, and again, I apologize for kind of going 10 minutes over.